5 years ago, the woman who was almost my daughter-in-law walked away from my son right at the altar. Tonight, I reached out to touch her trembling shoulders in the emergency room, only to see yellowed bruises that told a truth far more horrifying than any betrayal. I stood there surrounded by that familiar smell of antiseptic at our local hospital, my hand still shaking after catching a glimpse of her face. 5 years is a long time enough for a person to learn how to pack away the hurt in a quiet corner. But just one look at the fear in Hannah's eyes, and everything came rushing back like it never left. Why was she back in this state? Why did those wounds look like they hurt so much? Hello to all my dear listeners. I hope you all are doing well, that your feet are steady and your hearts are warm, even if the weather outside is shifting a bit. If you can hear my voice, please do me a favor and hit that like button or leave a kind word about how you are doing in the comments. Your presence means the world to me. Now let us head back to that night where the past and the present collided in the most shocking way. That night, the storm had just passed over the state, leaving behind that thick, humid, and heavy air so typical of the South. I was sorting through stacks of records at the volunteer desk when the ambulance siren wailed in loud and urgent, and enough to tear your heart right out of your chest. Being an older nurse, I have seen plenty of night shifts, but the chill that ran down my spine today felt different. As the stretcher was pushed in, I rushed over to help out of habit. Under those harsh white fluorescent lights, the face of the woman appeared. It was Hannah. My heart felt like it stopped beating and my legs went numb as if they were nailed down to the cold tile floor. For 5 years, I had imagined 1,000 ways to face the person who left my son at the altar, but never like this. Hannah lay there, her breath coming in short gasps. Her hair matted with blood and road dust, her eyes closed tight, but her face still cringing as if she were waiting for the next blow to land. My hands shook as I took the scissors to cut away her rain-soaked jacket. When that heavy fabric fell away, the breath caught tight in my throat. On Hannah's thin upper arms, there were more than just scratches from the car accident we had heard about. There were old bruises faded to a sickly pale yellow and green with the clear marks of someone's fingers, where they had squeezed her heartlessly. This was not the work of a simple traffic collision. These were the marks of being held down and shoved around, the kind of things I have seen too often in my years of medical service. Hannah groaned softly, her hand reaching out into the air like she was looking for a way out, mumbling words that made no sense in her daze. The resentment I had carried for so long was suddenly replaced by a deep disgust for whoever had done this to her. Hannah was not some traitor living her best life somewhere. She was a little bird with broken wings, barely holding on right in front of me. I stood there frozen, looking at the doctor on duty, feeling a physical pain spread across my own chest. Hannah suddenly opened her eyes, her gaze dull from the pain and the medicine. When she recognized me, a look of pure terror filled her eyes, and it was not fear of me, but the fear of being seen. She tried to cover the bruises on her neck with a weak movement, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but then she just stopped. That quiet indifference of a victim who is all too used to being mistreated made my heart ache. I looked down at the accident report the paramedics had handed over, claiming it was just a minor collision from losing control of the wheel. It was a clumsy lie meant to hide a living hell. In that moment, the numbness of the shock started to turn into a cold determination. I was not just a hurt mother anymore. I was the last line of defense for this girl. As I gently placed my hand on Hannah's forehead, I could feel the trembling shaking through her whole body. Hannah had come back carrying a dark secret I never could have imagined. But James, my son, I wondered if he could even stand the sight of this woman in the hospital after everything he had been through. I looked out the window where the darkness of the night still held on tight. and I knew that tomorrow would not be like any other day. What I was about to find in Hannah's old belongings would make this awakening hurt even more than I realized. I made it back to my quiet house in Savannah after the clock had already ticked past midnight. Sitting there in my small kitchen, sipping on a warm cup of chamomile tea, my eyes just naturally drifted to the glass cabinet where that unframed wedding photo of James and Hannah still sits. 5 years ago, I put every bit of $20,000 into that day, money from my retirement fund, and the insurance from my late husband. I wanted everything to be perfect. So I filled the hall with white lilies because those were Hannah's favorite. I can still remember how happy I felt seeing my son smile. But then, when she just vanished into thin air, it turned our celebration into a kind of spiritual funeral for this whole family. For all these years, I have carried a heavy bitterness in my chest, asking myself where I went wrong, and if I had just given too much of my heart and my savings only to be repaid with such cold betrayal. But the way Hannah looked at me in the hospital tonight has been haunting my spirit, and it didn't look like the eyes of a liar who just decided to show back up. I started turning over old memories in my head, thinking about the times Hannah would jump just a little bit if James raised his voice even a tiny amount. I remembered how she always wore those long sleeves, even when the Georgia summer was so hot and sticky you could hardly breathe. All those little broken pieces started fitting together into a scary pattern that I just didn't see at the time. That girl didn't run away because she stopped loving my son. She ran because she was being eaten alive by a fear that had worn her soul down to nothing. That truth made my chest tighten up like I couldn't get enough air. I realized I spent 5 whole years hating a woman who was actually just fighting to stay alive. The sadness I felt started shifting into a slow, burning anger. But for once, it wasn't aimed at Hannah. I stood up and started clearing away those old bills and that dusty photograph. I told myself, enough is enough. I cannot let this misunderstanding go on for one more minute. I looked down at my hands. They are older now, but they are still the strong hands of a nurse who has pulled hundreds of people back from the edge. I made a promise to myself right then that I would find whoever put Hannah in that living hell. I know James isn't going to find this easy to hear, but as a mother and the one who holds this Mitchell family together, it is my job to bring the truth into the light. That numb feeling from the shock was gone, replaced by a cold and certain choice. I am not going to just sit back and watch anymore. Tonight, I am starting a plan, not one to get even, but one to protect. The first light of morning started peeking through the window blinds, telling me a new day was on its way. I knew I had to keep myself healthy and sharp to handle what was coming next. A little time just for myself to get my head straight for this quiet fight was exactly what I needed right about now. This morning, I woke up and just let myself lie there for a bit on that new mattress I bought last year, which was the only big thing I treated myself to for my chronic back pain. Instead of rushing around with worries, I slipped my feet into my comfortable Skechers shoes, walked out onto the porch, and just took in that fresh, early morning air. I decided to walk to the park nearby, a habit I had completely let go of since James had his trouble. Feeling the green grass under my feet, hearing the birds, and seeing the other seniors doing Tai Chi made my heart feel so light, it was strange. For the first time in so many years, I felt like I was not carrying the whole world on my shoulders. After my walk, I stopped by Barnes & Noble and picked out a new novel and treated myself to a warm latte. Sitting in my usual corner, I turned up the text size on my Kindle and just got lost in those pages without having to worry about anybody else. I realized that to protect Hannah, I first had to be the strongest and steadiest version of myself. Taking care of myself like this is not being selfish. It is how I fill up my soul, which has been so worn down. Every sip of coffee and every page I read felt like medicine helping me find that peace I lost a long time ago. I picked up the phone and called Sister Mary, my best friend from the church women's group. Her voice was warm and full of understanding like it always is. We did not talk much about Hannah, but she reminded me that the Lord always has a plan for souls that have been hurt. That short talk was so powerful and made me feel like I was not alone in this journey anymore. I came back home with a whole new mindset, ready to face whatever storms might be coming. A feeling of freedom and hope just washed over me, and I knew I was ready to set those first boundaries to protect the ones I love. But that peace did not last very long. Just as I stepped inside my front door, the house phone started ringing with a sharp and unfamiliar sound. A man's voice, sounding very polite, but hiding something manipulative, came through the line, calling himself Hannah's worried husband. The first real confrontation had officially started. Hello to all my dear sisters out there. I wonder how the weather is where you are today. Is it warm enough for you to put on your most comfortable shoes and go for a walk like I did? What do you usually do to find some peace after those long and tired days? Please share with me in the comments so we can keep each other encouraged. Hello, Mrs. Mitchell. This is Mark, Hannah's husband. The voice came through the phone line sounding so sweet, it actually made me shiver with a bad feeling. He started out with all these polite questions, asking how my health was holding up and if I was staying cool in this thick Georgia humidity, before he quickly shifted into playing the part of a poor, broken man who had been done wrong. He told me he was frantically looking for his wife, claiming she was out of her mind and had run away with every bit of the money they had worked so hard to save up together. I sat there at my kitchen table looking at a stack of Medicare papers and gripped that phone until my knuckles turned white, while my palms got wet with sweat. But I forced my voice to stay as calm as a quiet Sunday morning in church. He kept going on and on about how Hannah had somehow injured herself during a bad panic attack, and how it just broke his heart that he was not there to protect his own wife from her own confusion. Every single word coming out of his mouth felt like a sharp needle poking right at the truth I had seen with my own eyes in that hospital emergency bay just last night. I stayed completely quiet and just let him have his stage, letting him think he was winning me over with his smooth little performance. Even with miles between us, I could feel the cold threat hiding right underneath those sugary words he was feeding me. He started mentioning that Hannah needed a very specific kind of medicine that only he knew how to manage, and if she did not get back to him soon, she would be a danger to herself and everybody else in that facility. It was that same old manipulation tactic I had studied back in my nursing days, where a person tries to make the victim look like they are crazy to the rest of the world, so no one will believe them. He was trying to plant those seeds of doubt in my mind, wanting me to think Hannah was just a lost soul who could not be trusted with her own life. But what he did not know was that I had spent years as a nurse, and I had seen those yellow and green bruises on her thin arms, and I knew for a fact that those marks do not lie, even if he does. I am very sorry to hear about your troubles, Mark, I said, finally cutting him off with a tone that was cold and as sharp as a razor, but still perfectly polite, like I was taught to be. I drew my first line in the sand right then and there, telling him that I was just a volunteer at the hospital, and that every piece of patient information was strictly private according to the law. The line went dead silent for a long beat, and I could almost feel his anger boiling over on the other end, just by the way his breathing turned heavy and ragged in my ear. All that fake sweetness just vanished into thin air, and his voice got much lower and very dangerous. He started bringing up my son James, saying that James would probably want to know the real truth about the woman who had lied to both of our families and left us all in the dark 5 years ago. Hearing him use my son's name to get to me made my heart hammer against my ribs, but I refused to let myself show any weakness to a man like him. He was trying to dig up all that old guilt and the pain our family had suffered through just so he could get his hands on whatever he was after. Mark, my son, is a grown man, and he is more than capable of seeing the truth for himself, I told him, keeping my words short and firm. I could feel my own confidence starting to rise up as I took the lead in that conversation and set my boundaries. I did not argue with him, and I did not try to explain anything. I just simply told him no when he asked Tonite where she was staying. He changed his tune one more time and started threatening to call the police, claiming that I was basically holding his wife against her will. "That is certainly your right to do so, Mark," I said before telling him to have a good afternoon and taking a deep breath. I ended that call right then and put the receiver back in its cradle. My legs were a little shaky when I stood up in my Skechers, but I had this small feeling of victory blooming in my chest. I knew this was only the beginning of things, and a man like that was not going to just walk away because of one phone call. I walked over to the window and watched the shadows stretching out across my yard, realizing I was now in a situation where every word and every move mattered. Hannah's life and the good name of the Mitchell family were both hanging in the balance now. I knew I had to move even faster and get things in order, like changing my locks and talking to someone who knows the law before he decided to show up at my front door. Later that evening, Hannah finally woke up and seemed to be more present in her own mind than she was before. When I walked into her hospital room carrying a bowl of hot chicken soup I had made, the fear in her eyes was so thick you could almost touch it, as if she expected me to start blaming her for leaving my son. But she did not realize that I was ready to listen to every single painful word she had been keeping inside for all these years. And my son James was already driving over to the hospital with a storm of his own brewing in his heart. I knew the three of us were about to have a conversation that would change everything forever, and I had to be ready for the truth. The pounding on my front door was so loud and sudden that it made me drop my favorite silver spoon right onto the kitchen floor with a sharp clang that echoed through my quiet Savannah home. James came charging in with eyes as red as Georgia clay and breath that smelled like nothing but pure exhaustion and old hurt. He did not even say hello before he saw Hannah sitting there, curled up tight and looking so small in my old lazy boy chair. He started yelling right away, throwing all that bitter pain from 5 years ago back in her face, asking her how she could just show up here after what she did to our family. I watched as Hannah flinched and reached for her side, her thin fingers pressing against her ribs that I knew had not healed right from all the kicks she had taken in the past. James was so blinded by his own anger that he could not see the yellow and green bruises hiding under her long sleeves, the clear marks of someone who had been squeezed and held down. I had to step right between them, feeling the full weight of being the spiritual anchor and the one who makes the hard decisions in this family. It was a moment where I felt my own power and voice being tested in the very house I had worked my whole life to keep safe. "Stop it right now, James," I screamed with the kind of authority that only a mother who has spent her life protecting her children can have. I grabbed Hannah's shaking shoulders, and I could feel her whole body cower and pull away, just like a victim who has spent too much time being terrified of anyone who raises their voice. I made James look straight into her eyes, which were clouded with a deep panic, and I told him about the threatening call I had just gotten from the man calling himself her husband. I spoke about the old scratches on her neck that she had been trying so hard to hide under her collar. Hannah started sobbing then, the tears running down her hawk-hack face, as she finally admitted that a violent shove from Mark was the real reason she lost control of her car that night. The air in my living room got so thick and heavy that it was hard to breathe, and I watched as James' anger just slowly turned into a stunned and hollow silence. He looked at her not as a woman who had betrayed him, but as a survivor who was barely holding on. But the worst part of that night was still coming for us. We heard a strange, scratching noise at the back door, and every one of us just froze solid like ice. He had found us, probably using an old key that Hannah had not been able to get away from him yet. Mark stood there in my doorway pretending to be a worried husband, but his eyes were burning with nothing but greed and a sickness to own her soul. He started shaming Hannah right in front of me and my son, calling her names, and claiming that all her property and her money were going to be his anyway. I saw Hannah get even more nutnyat than she already was, avoiding any eye contact and sliding behind my back like I was the only shield she had left in this world. My anger just boiled over right then, not because of what happened 5 years ago, but because of the raw cruelty standing right there on my rug. I saw him for exactly what he was, a man who used silence and fear as a punishment to keep a good woman in a cage. I kicked him out of my house with every bit of the Kienkung strength I have left as a black woman who has already seen enough storms to last 3 lifetimes. He left us with one last bitter threat, swearing that we would all regret sticking our noses into what he called his family business. After that door finally clicked shut, and I locked it tight, I felt as worn out and hollowed as if I had just lived through a second Hurricane Katrina. James just sat right down on the floor and took Hannah's hand. And for the first time in 5 long years, he did not look at her like she was an enemy. We all sat there in the quiet of the night, knowing that this fight for her dignity and her life was only just getting started. The shock was starting to wear off, leaving behind a cold and sharp awareness that we were in the middle of a battle we could not afford to lose. I did not sleep a single wink that night, just kept my eyes open and watched over Hannah while she slept under the temporary security James and I managed to put together. I realized right then that I had to stop being afraid and start being strategic with every move I made. I knew I needed to find a lawyer who understood these things, and I needed to change every single lock and put up cameras so no one could ever sneak up on us again. The safety and the honor of the Mitchell family has to come before everything else in this world. I will not let all the hard work of my life be stolen or worn away by a man who thinks he can take what does not belong to him. With James standing by my side, I started making a list of every single thing we needed to do to turn this house into a real foul die for Hannah. Even though my old body was raw and aching in every joint, my mind was as sharp and clear as a bell. I thought about what my late husband used to tell me about our duty to protect those who are too weak to protect themselves. Hannah is more than just a girl who almost married into this family. She is a wounded soul that needs a long time to heal. I am going to help her get her power and her voice back, starting with the very smallest things, like not having to jump and hide every time there is a loud noise in the house. We are not going to back down from his dirty tricks or his lies. That first little bit of peace after the storm had finally started to grow in my heart, and I was going to guard it with everything I have. Early the next morning, I did not wait for the sun to get high before I picked up the phone to call the best lawyer in this part of Georgia. We needed to build a legal wall around Hannah before Mark could make his next move against her. While James stayed busy changing every single lock in the house, I realized I had to start looking into her bank accounts and her papers too. I had to protect her money and her things before that man could find a way to steal what she had worked her whole life to save. The first thing I did was reach out to a professional lawyer who really understands how to protect our seniors and folks who have been mistreated. We gathered around the sturdy round table in my kitchen, where so many of our family decisions have been made over the years, to talk through how to cancel those shady power of attorney papers Hannah had been forced to sign when she was scared and confused. I have learned through my years of nursing that keeping your money safe is just as vital as keeping your body safe. That man had been working hard to control every single one of her bank accounts and her credit cards, making her feel like she could not survive a single day without him. We went right ahead and opened a brand new account at a bank he cannot even find, and we set up security questions that only Hannah and I would ever know the answers to. While I was handling the paperwork, James was staying busy outside and inside the house, installing a high-tech camera system so we can see exactly what is happening around us at all times. We took out all those old locks and put in new smart locks that require a specific code to get through. Every time I heard that solid click of the new bolt sliding into place, I felt a little more of that heavy weight lift off my spirit. I also sat Hannah down and helped her cut off every digital tie she had, to that man changing her phone number and completely deleting those old social media accounts where he used to track her every move. We were not going to be sitting ducks anymore. We were actively building a safe place for her to finally breathe. I also kept my nurse eyes on Hannah's physical health, making sure she was getting what she needed to heal. I went out and got her some good quality calcium and vitamin D supplements to help that broken rib of hers knit back together properly. I wanted her to feel nothing but soft comfort while she was staying in my home. So I went to Talbot's and picked out some cotton sweaters and easy-wear pants in the fabrics I have always trusted for myself. Seeing her dressed in clean, nice clothes seemed to help her start finding a little bit of that self-esteem that had been worn down to nothing over the last 5 years. Taking care of those small physical details was like a quiet way of telling her that she was worth being cared for. We spent hours going through every old bill and bank statement we could get our hands on. It did not take long for me to find several large withdrawals and strange payments that Hannah did not know anything about. Seeing those numbers on paper was like finding the proof we needed to show just how much he had been taking from her behind her back. I felt a deep sense of focus coming over me as all that earlier fear turned into a very clear plan of action. Every piece of evidence we found was another brick in the wall we were building to keep her safe from his greed. In the evenings, we started a new routine of sitting together in the living room, watching those peaceful home renovation shows on HGTV, just to keep our minds off the stress. Hannah even started talking about wanting to get her hands back in the dirt and start a little garden, which was a hobby she had not touched in years. I made a trip over to the Home Depot and bought her a brand new set of gardening tools and some colorful flowers to plant in the pots on my porch. Real safety is not just about having good locks on your doors. It is about finding that peace in your soul where you can actually enjoy the sunshine again. Watching her gently pat the soil around a new hydrangea bush made me realize that life was finally starting to return to her spirit. Finally, I helped Hannah get all her personal papers and her ID organized in a way that she could manage herself. Seeing her take back control of her own business made her stand a little taller, and her voice sound a little stronger than it did that first night in the emergency room. We both knew that man was still out there, probably lurking around and waiting for an opening, but our fortress was ready for him. Having that sense of control over our own lives again was the best kind of medicine for both of us. We were not looking over our shoulders every second because we knew we had done everything possible to be prepared. Everything seemed like it was finally moving in the right direction until one afternoon while I was out front watering my flowers. A neighbor of mine that I usually only wave to from a distance started walking toward my porch with a very worried look on her face. She told me she had heard that loud shouting match from the other day, and she felt like she needed to share something she had seen with her own eyes. My heart started to beat a little faster as she stepped closer because I could tell by her eyes that she was about to tell me something that would change the way I looked at this whole situation. Mrs. Henderson from down the street came by with a tray of warm baked goods and a look in her eyes that said she already knew. She reached out and touched my hand so gently, telling me she had heard the commotion the other day and wanted me to know I was not in this by myself. She told me that if I ever needed a witness or just someone to sit and talk with, she was only a few doors away. It brought a sting of tears to my eyes, because in this fast and often cold world, the simple kindness of a neighbor feels like a warm fire on a winter night. I opened up my heart and told her a bit of what we were going through, and she gave me her word that she would support us without any conditions. Before the day was even over, Sister Mary, my dear friend from the church women's group, drove over 2 hours just to check on us. She brought her unwavering faith and a promise that she would stand right beside the Mitchell family, even saying she was willing to testify to Hannah's good character if it ever came to that. As the three of us women sat around my kitchen table, I felt a heavy weight lift off my chest because I finally realized I was no longer fighting this battle alone. Having that social connection and seeing my faith in the goodness of others being restored gave me a kind of spiritual strength that money just cannot buy. Watching these people step up for her, even those who were practically strangers, made Hannah smile for the very first time since she arrived. You could see the change in her eyes. Not being isolated and alone anymore gave her the courage to start facing the hard truth of her past. I whispered a quiet thank you to the Lord for sending us these wonderful allies right when our spirits were starting to flag. The strength we find in our community is a powerful thing that a person like Mark can never understand, and he certainly cannot take it away with his threats or his money. The support of my friends and neighbors gave me the push I needed to finally go in and clean up the old guest room where Hannah had been staying. And while I was reaching into the very back of the closet, I found something I never expected. A small bag tucked away in a dark corner, filled with evidence Hannah had tried to hide from the world 5 years ago. To all my dear sisters listening, have you ever had a neighbor or an old friend show up with exactly what you needed right when things were at their worst? During our hardest days, that connection we have with one another is the best kind of medicine for the soul, isn't it? I would love for you to say hello, or maybe share a beautiful memory of a kind neighbor in the comments so we can all be encouraged. It was an old envelope, thick and gray with years of dust that had settled in the deepest part of that closet. But what was tucked inside chilled me right to my bones. As I pulled out those papers, I found printed emails and text messages dating back 5 whole years, and they laid out a plan so cold and calculated it made my skin crawl. It turns out Mark had been watching Hannah for a long time, planning his move because he knew she was about to inherit a significant amount of money from her family. He had spent months whispering poison in her ear, manipulating her into believing that my son James only cared about her bank account and not her heart. The raw and ugly truth finally came into the light. That day at the wedding, Hannah did not run away because she had a change of heart or stopped loving my son. She fled that church in a panic because Mark had threatened to cause James a world of hurt if she did not leave with him right that second. I felt a wave of pure disgust rushing through my veins like ice water. I realized then that this man was not just some angry husband. He was a professional predator who made a living out of finding vulnerable young women with property and wearing them down. Among those papers were documents where he had clearly forged Hannah's signature to try and transfer the ownership of her family home over to his name. Every word on those pages and every dollar amount listed was a witness to the twisted mind of a man who was clearly struggling with his own demons and a greed that knew no bounds. Any tiny bit of doubt I had left about him, maybe once loving her, just vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but the truth of his cruelty. I did not waste a single heartbeat before calling our lawyer and making several copies of everything I had found. We knew right away that this was the secret weapon we needed to finally turn the tide and win this fight for Hannah's freedom. When Hannah looked over those papers, she looked like she was going through a second shock, her face turning ashen as she realized just how long she had been used. The pain of knowing she had been a pawn in his game for all these years was heavy, but it brought a sense of absolute clarity that she had never had before. For the first time in 5 years, she did not have to carry that crushing weight of guilt for leaving James. She finally understood that in her own way, she had been trying to be his shield. James stood there right beside her, his fists clenched tight at his sides, but his eyes were filled with a deep and quiet sorrow for everything she had endured. He whispered to her, asking why she had not just told him the truth back then, and Hannah could only shake her head as the tears started falling down her face. The truth was finally out in the open, and it swept away all those years of suspicion and hurt that had sat between them like a wall. We started getting the full dossier ready to send over to the authorities and to the lawyers on the other side, feeling a new kind of power rising up in us. That realization of what had really happened gave us a steady and unbreakable resolve to make sure Hannah finally got the justice she deserved. With all that evidence finally in my hands, I knew a man like Mark was not going to just sit still and let us win. He was likely going to get even more desperate and use even dirtier tricks to try and stay in control. In the middle of all that mounting tension, I found myself walking out to that small corner of the yard that always reminds me of my late husband. I needed to find a little bit of spiritual ground to stand on so I could keep my footing for the rest of this journey. I sat quietly under that old oak tree in the backyard, the very spot where my husband used to sit and read his newspaper every Saturday afternoon. I reached out and ran my hand over the rough, thick bark, and for a moment, it felt just like I was holding onto his warm hand again. In that still, quiet space, I had a long talk with him in my heart, remembering everything he ever taught me about having integrity and the kind of courage it takes to protect your family. Thinking about the deep, steady love he always gave us started to pour a new kind of spiritual power into my tired soul, helping me shake off all that heavy exhaustion and the worries that had been pulling at me. I felt a sense of peace settling over me, knowing that the spirit of our family was still standing strong. I started thinking back to those early years when we were just starting out and had to pull together through some real hard economic times. We survived that stagflation and the oil crisis in the 70s, working and saving until we finally built this home and this life for ourselves. He was always our rock, the spiritual pillar that kept us all upright. And I realize now that it was my turn to carry that same torch for the Mitchell family. I could almost see him in my mind, giving me that little encouraging smile and telling me I had to fight until the very end for our honor and our heritage. This comfort brought a strange and beautiful peace over me, a kind of steady resolve that felt as deep and unshakable as the roots of that old Georgia oak reaching down into the earth. When I finally stood up, I did not feel like a 65-year-old woman standing all alone anymore. I felt like I was carrying the spirit of my husband and all those resilient African-American ancestors who came before me. I walked back into the house with a light in my eyes that had not been there for a long time, a fire of pure determination. Hannah looked up at me, and I could tell she saw the change immediately because she seemed to sit a little taller herself. We were both ready now for whatever dirty trick that man was going to try and play on us next. But that quiet peace did not stay with us for very long at all. One morning, not long after, A car with the official seal of social services pulled right up into my driveway. That man had gone and done something truly low, making a false report and claiming that I was holding Hannah against her will and that her mental health was in a dangerous state. The real battle for Hannah's freedom was knocking right at my front door. The social worker walked through my front door carrying a thick stack of folders and a look on their face that was filled with nothing but suspicion and a whole lot of doubt. Mark had been busy spinning a wicked web of lies, claiming that I was some kind of predator taking advantage of Hannah's shaky mental health just to steal whatever she had left to her name. That feeling of having my private home and my good name violated like that made a fire of outrage rise up in my chest, but I reached back and found that steady professional nurse I have been for so many years. I invited them to sit down at my kitchen table, where I had already laid out every single piece of medical and financial proof we had been gathering up, like we were preparing for a storm. That interview was as tight and suffocating as a room with the windows painted shut, and the air felt like it was pressing in on all of us from every side. They started hitting us with these sharp and tricky questions about whether Hannah was truly in her right mind to make her own choices, and exactly why she had not spoken a single word to her husband in all this time. I sat there and watched Hannah take one long deep breath, and for the very first time since she came back, she sat up tall in her chair and answered them for herself with real poise and dignity. She spoke with a clear voice about that cold fear she felt every single time she heard his voice, and she told them the raw truth about being kept like a prisoner in a house that was supposed to be her sanctuary. I made sure to hand them the copies of those threatening text messages and the evidence we had found about him trying to pay off some private doctor just to get a fake mental health report on her. I did not pull any punches, and I looked that social worker right in the eye as I exposed the whole plan to steal Hannah's property and her inheritance. I explained to them that this was a textbook case of financial abuse where a man tries to pick a woman apart when she is already dealing with some physical and mental hurt. I could see the attitude of that social worker starting to shift as they looked at the yellow bruises that were still visible on Hannah's thin arms and the long list of pharmacy bills I had been paying out of my own pocket to get her back on her feet. Our unbowed spirit and the mountain of hard proof we had were finally starting to break through that wall of doubt they walked in with. Mark had even gone as far as trying to set up a mental health exam with some private doctor that we knew was sitting right in his pocket. But I had my lawyer on speakerphone, and I stood my ground with a determination that surprised even me, telling them that we would absolutely not be part of that sham. I demanded that she get an independent exam from the official state medical system, because I knew a real professional would see she was as sharp and clear as she could be. Seeing me so steady and knowledgeable about her rights made the other side start to look real confused and worried, because they knew they could not just walk over us. In that moment, I felt like I was standing up for more than just one girl. I was standing up for the dignity and the justice of every woman in my community. Finally, that social worker packed up their folders, and they looked at us with a whole lot more sympathy and kindness than they had an hour before. They promised us they would be looking into exactly why such a false and mean-spirited report was even filed in the first place. I felt this huge wave of relief wash over me like a cooling rain. But I knew in my soul that this was not the end of our journey. That man was not going to stop his tricks until he was finally brought out into the bright light of justice. Hannah and I just looked at each other, and we felt so proud because we had stood our ground and won that first big battle of minds with the authorities. That night, we all got busy in the kitchen and fixed up a real traditional dinner with some crispy fried chicken and golden cornbread that filled the whole house with the smell of home. Hannah was actually eating with a real appetite and enjoying the food, which was a beautiful sign that her spirit was finally starting to heal up from the inside. I looked over at James and told him he had to stay alert and keep his guard up because I knew a formal court case would be showing up on our doorstep any day now. We had won the battle today, but we all knew we had to be ready for the final war. Just a few days later, a long white envelope with the official stamp of the Savannah County Court was delivered to my house. It was the formal summons for the hearing that would decide who would have legal control over Hannah's life and all her property. The whole house went quiet and felt real heavy with the weight of knowing that the time for the final judgment was finally here. We spent what felt like an eternity sitting in that lawyer's office, where the air was thick with the scent of old paper-stale coffee and the heavy ink of 1,000 signatures that had come before us. We were hunched over that big mahogany table, going over every single line in the files, making sure there was not a single loose thread that man could pull on to unravel our lives. While we were there, a letter arrived from Mark's legal team, and it was exactly what I expected from a man like him. A settlement offer that was nothing more than a low-down attempt to rob Hannah one last time. They basically told her that if she gave up her rights to the family house and a good chunk of her savings, Mark would agree to drop all the court cases and just leave her be for good. It was a cold-hearted piece of blackmail wrapped up in fancy legal words, a way to try and buy his way out of the trouble he had caused by pretending it was a fair deal. I felt my stomach turn just reading those words. But then I looked over at Hannah. She did not hesitate for even a single second. She squeezed her hands together in her lap until her knuckles were white, and she just looked that lawyer in the eye and shook her head, saying, "Not in this lifetime." Seeing her stand her ground with such a quiet and steady fire after all the years of being pushed around made my heart swell with a deep pride. We told our lawyer right then that we were not interested in any of their shady deals, and that we would see them in the courtroom where the truth actually matters. Our lawyer started getting us ready for the cross-examination, focusing on exactly how we were going to peel back the layers of lies Mark had been building up like a wall around himself. We rasoatlai the whole timeline of everything that had happened from the moment Hannah left the altar to the day she showed up in my emergency room. We looked at those suspicious bank withdrawals and the names of the folks from our community and the church who were ready to stand up and speak for her character. The office was quiet as we worked, but it was that kind of heavy silence you get right before a summer storm breaks over the Savannah River. I felt this strange and beautiful kind of calm settling over me because I knew we had done the work, and we had the solid truth on our side. It was not about getting revenge or hurting anyone. It was about finally having a quiet life again, where we did not have to look over our shoulders every time the wind caught a door. We even took the time to talk about how to protect Hannah's Social Security and her Medicare benefits, because Mark had been trying to find a way to get his hands on those too. It showed just how far he was willing to go to leave her with nothing, and it made me realize how important it is for us, especially as we get a little older, to really understand our rights and the laws that are meant to protect our dignity. It is a kind of power that no one can just take away from you if you know how to stand on it. James stayed right there with us the whole time, his face set in a firm and steady look, as he promised he would be right by our side in that courtroom. He made it clear he was not going to let that man get anywhere near Hannah or try to scare her with those mean looks he likes to give. Having my son stand there as the protector of our family made me feel like the Mitchell name was finally being restored to what it was always meant to be. On the very last night before the hearing, I helped Hannah pick out a navy blue suit I had gotten for her from Talbot's. It was elegant and simple, and I wanted her to walk into that courthouse looking like the self-assured and dignified woman she truly is, and not the victim Mark tried to make her believe she was. Before we went to bed, we sat together on the edge of the mattress and held hands for a long time. We had a deep prayer asking the Lord for the strength to speak our truth, and asking for the wisdom of our ancestors to guide our steps through those heavy courthouse doors. This fight was not just about her or the money or the house. It was for every woman in our community who has ever had to hide her bruises and live in the shadows of someone else's cruelty. We were standing up for all of them, and I could feel their spirits giving us the strength to keep our heads high. When the sun came up the next morning, we got dressed and headed out, walking into that courthouse with our spirits steady and our hearts full of a cold determination. I could see Mark standing there in the hallway with his lawyer looking all smug and like he had already won the day before it even started. He had that oily smile on his face that used to make Hannah shiver and pull away, but he had no idea that we were walking in there with a secret weapon that was about to bring his whole world of lies crashing down around his feet. We walked right past him without saying a word, and I knew that by the time this day was over, the truth was finally going to set us all free. The air inside that Savannah courtroom was so heavy, and still, it felt like the very walls were leaning in to hear the secrets we had been carrying for all these years. Sitting on those hard wooden benches, I could hear the faint ticking of the clock and the steady rustle of papers that sounded like dry leaves in the wind. Mark's lawyer stood up first, and he started weaving a tale that was as smooth as molasses, but filled with the bitter taste of lies. He tried to tell the judge that Mark was just a devoted husband, a man who had spent the last 5 years trying to care for a wife who had lost her way and her mind. I sat there in the gallery with my hands folded in my lap, watching Mark pretend to be a victim dabbing at his eyes with a clean white handkerchief, like he was some kind of saint. But then, it was finally our turn. When our lawyer stood up, he did not raise his voice or move with a lot of flash. He just started laying out the secret weapon we had found. One by one, those old emails and text messages from 5 years ago were projected onto the screen for the whole room to see. The cold and calculated words where he talked about her inheritance, like it was already his, made the whole courtroom go silent with shock. I watched Mark then, and the smug look on his face just started to crumble like wet sand. He started dabbing at the real sweat running down his forehead as he realized that his own words were finally being used to pull back the curtain on his greed. The room got even quieter when it was time for Hannah to take the stand. She stood up and walked to that witness box wearing that navy blue Talbot suit and looking like a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light of her own truth. Her voice did not shake even a little bit as she started telling the judge the raw and ugly story of what those 5 years had really been like. She talked about being kept in that house like a bird in a cage, and the times he had hit her so hard, she lost consciousness. She told the whole room about the day of the wedding, and how the absolute terror he put in her heart was the only reason she had run away from the man she loved. She was not that cowering girl in the emergency room anymore. She was a survivor, standing tall and demanding the justice that had been denied to her for far too long. I sat there in the second row holding James's hand so tight I could feel his pulse racing, and the tears were just streaming down my face from a mix of pure pride and the relief of finally hearing her say it out loud. The judge was an older man with deep lines in his face and eyes that seemed to see right through every bit of nonsense. He sat there leaning forward and listening to every single word she said, looking over the medical records of her broken rib and the old nursing notes I had kept. When Mark's lawyer tried to stand up and say something mean to twist her words or tried to make her look confused, the judge shut him down with a look so sharp it could have cut glass. He told that man to sit right back down and have some respect for the truth. You could feel the whole mood of the room shifting, like the wind changing direction before a storm. All those manipulative tricks and the lies Mark had been using to keep his power were being exposed under the bright lights of that courtroom. And for the first time in years, I felt like the world was finally being put right. When the judge finally leaned back and prepared to give his verdict, the silence was so thick you could hardly breathe. He looked right at Mark and told him that in all his years on the bench, he had rarely seen a man behave with such calculated cruelty and greed. He ruled completely in Hannah's favor, dismissing every single claim Mark had made and granting her a permanent restraining order that meant he could never come near her or her family again. The judge ordered every cent of the money he had stolen and every piece of property he had tried to take to be returned to her immediately. Before he struck his gavel, he looked at Hannah and told her that she was free to live her life without fear. The sound of that gavel hitting the wood was like a thunderclap that broke the spell of the last 5 years. Hannah turned around and just fell into my arms, sobbing with a kind of happiness that I have never heard before. And James was right there, wrapping his arms around both of us as we all let out the breath we had been holding for so long. I watched the bailiffs lead Mark out of that courtroom, and he looked like a man who had suddenly lost everything. He did not have that tall and arrogant way of walking anymore. He just looked small and hollowed out now that he could not use fear as a weapon. We walked out of that courthouse together, and the Savannah sun was shining down on us with a warmth that felt like a blessing from heaven itself. Walking down those stone steps felt like 1,000 pounds had been lifted off my shoulders and left behind in that room. The air tasted cleaner, and the world looked brighter than it had in a very long time. We stood there on the sidewalk for a minute, just taking it all in, knowing that the battle was finally over and that the Mitchell family name had been restored to its honor. When we finally made it back home that evening, the house did not feel like a fortress anymore. It just felt like a home filled with a quiet and beautiful peace. I went into the kitchen and started getting things ready for dinner, while James and Hannah sat out on the porch together. For the first time in 5 long years, they were not talking about the past or the hurt. They were just talking about the future and what they wanted to do with their new freedom. I looked at them through the window and felt a warmth in my chest because I knew I had done exactly what my late husband would have wanted me to do. I had protected our family and stood up for what was right, and I had guided that young woman back to her own power. The shadows were finally gone, and the first day of our new life had finally begun in earnest. A few months after the trial, everything in our lives had shifted into a new and steady rhythm. Hannah had gotten her confidence back and was starting to make plans for her own place and her own business again. She was standing on her own 2 feet, and it was a beautiful thing to see. As for me, I was starting to look at my own life and realizing that I had some choices to make about my own next chapter now that the storm had passed and the sky was finally clear. It has been a full year since that historic day in the courtroom, and life has bloomed in ways I never thought possible. Hannah went ahead and sold that house, filled with so many heavy and painful memories, and she moved herself into a bright little apartment near the coast where the golden sun hits the floor just right every single morning. She has been following her passion for gardening and has even started a local class to teach life skills to other women who have survived the same kind of abuse she lived through. James and Hannah have stayed the best of friends, supporting one another as they heal the scars that the past left on their hearts. As for me, I have finally been taking the time to go on those Alaska cruises I dreamed about for so many years, enjoying a life that is full of quiet freedom and peace. I have come to realize that true forgiveness is not about forgetting the pain you went through, but it is about finally releasing yourself from the tight grip of hatred. To all my dear listeners out there, the story of Margot and Hannah is proof of the real power of love and the courage it takes to stand up for what is right. We women who have walked through so many ups and downs in this life must never let anyone take away our voice or our right to choose our own path. Just remember that no matter how big the storm gets, The sun always comes out after the rain, and justice will always find a way to smile on those who keep searching for the truth. Your worth is not found in the way other people treat you, but it is found in the way you stand strong and protect the people you love. Thank you so much for walking this long journey with me today. I wish all of my sisters peace and happiness and a spirit that is always full of strength in everything you do. Thank you for sharing this time with me. It means so much to have you here. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with a sister who needs to hear it. We are never alone when we stand together. Stay strong, keep your light shining, and stay blessed until next time.